The Great Hall of Ashvale stood as a grim monument of granite and malice, 3 stories tall. Draped in the pelts of butchered enemies and heavy obsidian and crimson pack banners depicting twin coiling wolves. Gold torches blazed in the iron sconces, throwing long, flickering shadows across the high-ranking warriors who held court. Under the cold, calculating gaze of Alpha Caden Voss, the pack thrived on politics and cruelty, an elite society built on the backs of the invisible. Moving along the perimeter of the room was Seraphina. Small, slight, with dark hair and freckles dusted across her brown skin, she carried a heavy wooden tray of medicines. She was an outcast in all but name, an Omega-born assistant to healer Marin, the elite pack physician who had taught her everything she knew about herbs and remedies. Seraphina moved with the practiced silence of an apex predator that had spent a decade pretending to be prey. She kept her amber eyes lowered, absorbing the room while revealing nothing. Her left hand throbbed from a fresh scrape she had taken while moving crates in the apothecary. Quietly, away from the prying eyes of the guards, she pressed her right palm over the injury. Instantly, a deep, comforting warmth flooded the broken skin. A faint, forbidden gold-green light pooled between her fingers, sewing the flesh back together within a single heartbeat. The light faded into the air as quickly as breath on glass. Seraphina closed her fist and kept walking. She had hidden this magical healing touch since childhood, knowing that things the pack could not control were deemed dangerous by Alpha Caden. Near the roaring hearth, Beta Dorian held court. The 26-year-old golden-haired usurper wore a smile like a weapon, his arrogant laughter echoing off the rafters. He wore 4 rank markings scarred into his throat, moving through the hierarchy with the absolute certainty of a future leader. Seraphina looked away, slipping out through the servants' corridor as the political chatter of the highborn wolves intensified. 2 days later, the bonding moon arrived, swelling in the midnight sky until the landscape was stripped of all shadows. The ancient stone circle outside the Great Hall was packed with the entire territory, the air humming with an electric, inescapable magical pull. Standing at the furthest edge of the gathering, Seraphina felt the pressure in her chest tighten. Her heart rhythm shifted, settling with absolute certainty. Her gaze cut across the crowded circle, locking directly onto Dorian. He was already staring back at her. For one suspended fraction of a second, an ancient, undeniable recognition sparked between them. But as the mate bond flared to life, Dorian's expression closed. His golden eyes went flat and cold. He straightened his shoulders, turning deliberately to Lyra, the high-born daughter of the Greymount Alpha, standing immaculate at his side. A political alliance had already been forged. Dorian stepped into the center of the ring, looking down at Seraphina with uncomplicated contempt. "I, Dorian of Ashvale, reject you." His voice boomed through the freezing night, deliberate and unwavering. The luminous bond in Seraphina's chest did not break quietly. It shattered with a physical agony that nearly doubled her over, a wound deeper than any flesh her hands had ever mended. Around her, a sharp laugh broke the silence, and within moments, the entire pack joined in, their mockery spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Alpha Caden stood motionless at the apex of the circle, offering no intervention. He had orchestrated this public humiliation, to ensure there would be no ambiguity, no appeal. Serafina forced her spine straight by sheer, unyielding will. She held Dorian's gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, marking his face in her mind. Then she turned and walked through the parting crowd. She counted 37 paces from the granite stones to the pitch-black tree line, her eyes burning but dry. The moment the shadows of the frozen forest swallowed her, her legs gave out. She collapsed against a pine trunk, a ragged, wordless sound tearing from her throat. Behind her, the clipped, final voice of Alpha Caden carried through the trees to the enforcers. Her belongings at the gate by morning. She leaves at dawn. Left with nothing but the clothes on her back and her strange, secret hands, Serafina pressed her palm into the bark. The wood warmed faintly under her touch. "Get up," she whispered to herself. "You are not done." The wilderness offered no sanctuary. For 8 brutal days, Serafina fought for every breath, building a crude shelter of pine boughs and packed snow that leaked wind from 3 directions. She thawed frozen berries against her palms and chewed bitter bark to survive, lighting fires through sheer desperation. On the 5th night, she fought off a pair of starving wild dogs with a heavy branch, screaming a furious battle cry that sent them fleeing into the dark. Yet the physical ache of the broken bond remained, a persistent hollowness behind her sternum. She strictly forbade herself from grieving Dorian. Her sorrow was for the lost dream of belonging, not for the traitor who had cast her aside. On the 8th morning, a heavy snowfall buried her shelter. As she lay in the suffocating dimness, wondering what the point of survival was, her hands began to glow unbidden. The gold-green light pressed through her fingers, radiating a fierce, localized heat. This time, the magic possessed a directional pull. Sitting up, she turned her palms like a compass until the warmth intensified, pointing northwest toward the oldest part of the forest, where the ancient pines knitted together into a dark ceiling. There, the magic whispered. Leaving her empty shelter, Serafina followed the persistent heat in her hands. She walked for hours, plunging through knee-deep snow and fighting biting winds, trusting the only thing that had not abandoned her. The trees thickened, their massive trunks carved with strange, forgotten patterns that predated the Ashvale pack entirely. Suddenly, her hands flared with blinding intensity. Serafina stopped. Just ahead, past a veil of frozen brambles, lay a secluded, shadowless clearing. Resting heavily against the roots of an ancient oak was a creature of mythic proportions. An enormous wolf, carrying the distinct aura of an ancient bloodline, lay dying in the crimson-stained snow. His fur was black as a starless sky. His eyes, the color of lightning caught in ice, flickered weakly as his breathing slowed to a ragged halt. Serafina gasped, recognizing the mortal wounds covering his massive flank. Dropping her branch, she fell to her knees beside the great beast, ignoring the sheer danger of his size. She didn't know his name, Orion. She didn't know he was the betrayed Alpha King, overthrown by his own treacherous war council and left to bleed out in the frozen wastes. She only knew that life was fading, and she refused to let the dark take him. Placing both hands flat against his torn, frozen chest, Seraphina unleashed the entirety of her forbidden magic. The gold-green light erupted from her palms, blinding and brilliant, flooding into the dying king. The snow around them melted into a circle of bare earth as the ancient runes on the surrounding trees began to hum in response. "Stay with me," she whispered, pouring every ounce of her life force into his healing. As Orion's massive chest heaved, his lightning blue eyes snapped open, locking onto hers with a sudden, possessive ferocity. In that explosive moment, the gold-green light of her heritage fused perfectly with the brilliant blue aura of his royal bloodline, binding them together in a blinding flash of raw, sovereign power. Months later, the heavy iron doors of the Ashvale fortress did not open. They shattered. The full moon hung high over the great hall, casting a bloody light over the war council. Beta Dorian sat upon the usurped throne, his golden hair gleaming under the torches as he raised a goblet to his co-conspirators. Alpha Caden stood nearby, his cold eyes surveying the newly established order. In the deep subterranean dungeons below, King Orion hung from heavy silver chains, his enormous black wolf form beaten, suppressed, and awaiting public execution at dawn. A deafening crash rattled the granite foundations. Through the dust and splintered wood of the shattered entrance strode Seraphina. She was no longer the slight, invisible healer's assistant. She wore dark, heavy leather armor forged in the deep wilderness, a dark cloak billowing behind her like a shadow. Balanced effortlessly on her shoulder was a massive, blood-stained claymore. Behind her, a fierce vanguard of lawless rogue warriors poured into the hall, their weapons bared, their snarling jaws dripping with the blood of the outer guards. The great hall erupted into chaos. Warriors drew their longswords, but Seraphina moved like a tempest. She swung the claymore with terrifying, lethal precision, cutting through Dorian's elite guard like dry straw. The cinematic ring of clashing steel and the desperate screams of the loyalists echoed off the three-story walls. Seraphina kicked open the heavy iron grate leading to the lower levels, her rogues securing the upper hall. She descended into the dark, damp dungeons, her boots echoing rhythmically on the stone steps. At the end of the corridor, inside the deepest cell, Orion hung from the ceiling, his massive forepaws bound in burning silver gongs, his black fur matted with dried blood. With a roar of pure defiance, Seraphina brought her claymore down onto the silver chains. The metal shattered with a deafening metallic ring. Orion collapsed to the stone floor, shifting into his towering human form, gasping for air as the silver burns on his wrists began to steam. Seraphina didn't hesitate. She knelt, slamming the tip of her massive claymore deep into the stone floor between them, anchoring her claim. Her hands erupted into an open, permanent glow of unified gold and brilliant blue light, illuminating the entire dungeon. She looked up at the royal wolf who had been betrayed by his own council, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, protective wrath. "Whoever dares touch my alpha," she declared, her voice echoing up the stairs and into the throne room like thunder. "I will burn this entire kingdom to ash." The awakened power. Seraphina stood over Orion, the sheer force of her newly unified magic radiating from her palms in blinding waves of gold and brilliant blue light. The subterranean air, once heavy with the stench of copper and despair, now crackled with an ancient electrical resonance. She kept the tip of her massive claymore anchored deep within the stone floor, her amber eyes burning with a protective fury that brooked no challenge. Beneath her, Orion let out a low, shuddering breath. The silver burns on his wrists began to smoke and fade as her healing light washed over his colossal frame. He looked up at his wife, his striking ice-blue eyes reflecting the terrifying, beautiful majesty of the sovereign she had become. The weak, sickly Luna the War Council had despised was gone, replaced by a warrior queen who had just broken the unbreakable. Up the winding stone steps, the heavy thud of armored boots began to echo. The rebellion had officially breached the inner sanctum. Secrets of the unbroken wilds. Seraphina's mind momentarily flashed back to the brutal trials that had brought her to this moment of absolute triumph. The dark days spent in the frozen wilderness after her exile from the Pack's outer limits. When Dorian had cruelly severed their ties under the shadowless moonlight of the stone circle, the betrayal had nearly broken her spirit. But the ancient forest had other designs. Deep within the snow-covered pines, guided by an undeniable internal warmth, she had stumbled upon a clearing marked by geometric and organic ruins. In the center of that sanctuary lay a massive black wolf, bleeding from calculated, lethal wounds inflicted by his own treacherous inner circle. She remembered the staggering scale of him. His shoulder had reached her chest even while he was collapsed on his side. His fur pulled the light inward, absorbing the illumination of her gold-green magic like a tear in the fabric of the visible world. She had knelt in the freezing snow, ignoring every survival instinct screaming at her to run from a beast that could swallow her whole. With trembling hands, she had poured the entirety of her forbidden magic into his failing body. She had felt the severed tissue reaching across the voids, the blood vessels sealing under her touch, and the ancient markings along his pelt responding to her light. They had saved each other in that silent, pale gold dawn. When she woke, the great wolf was gone, leaving behind concentric rings etched into the very bark of the surrounding pines, and a silver-black mark running from the inside of her left wrist to her palm, a mark that pulsed like a second heartbeat. The rising tension in the great hall. While Seraphina was discovering the true depth of her expanding gifts in the wilderness, learning to navigate the interior of living things, healing fractured creatures, and mending lightning-split trees with absolute accuracy, a suffocating dread had settled over the great hall. The scouts had returned from the border corridors, wide-eyed and trembling. They reported massive tracks, the width of shields, and the complete disappearance of elite patrols with no evidence of a struggle. Dorian, the arrogant, golden-haired usurper who had traded his fated mate for political status, had grown pale. He drank heavily at the high table, his eyes darting anxiously toward the northern windows where the old forest loomed. Dorian and the traitorous War Council had believed they were secure after staging their coup and dragging Alpha King Orion down to the dark cells. They believed the broken, exiled Seraphina would perish in the winter freeze. They had no idea that their actions had unleashed the true sovereign of the Lunara. The reckoning begins. The memory dissolved as the heavy iron doors at the top of the dungeon stairs burst open. Dorian stepped into the torchlight, flanking a vanguard of armored pack enforcers. His golden hair was disheveled, and his handsome features were twisted in a mixture of shock and sheer terror as he beheld the glowing, unified light filling the cavernous room. "Seraphina?" Dorian choked out, his gaze dropping from her glowing hands to the shattered silver chains on the floor. And finally, to the towering, resplendent figure of Orion rising to his full height beside her. "This is impossible." "You were an Omega assistant to Marin. You are nothing." Seraphina gripped the hilt of her claymore with both hands, lifting the massive blade from the stone floor with effortless grace. The unified gold and blue light flared, casting long, predatory shadows against the damp granite walls. "I am Seraphina of the Lunara," she said, her voice dropping into a lethal, rhythmic cadence that vibrated through the sternum of every warrior in the room. "And you are a traitor, standing in my kingdom." Orion stepped forward, his massive chest expanding as he drew in a deep, unimpeded breath. The ice-blue light in his eyes flared to life, answering the call of his queen's magic. The bond between them, forged in the snow and sealed in blood, was absolute. Dorian took a panicked step backward, his hand trembling on the pommel of his sword as the rogue wolves Seraphina had commanded began to pour into the chamber from the outer corridors. Cutlasses and long swords drawn. The layout of the fortress had changed. The hierarchy had flipped. The hunt was over, and the public claim had just begun. The heavy iron doors of the great hall groaned against their hinges, shuddering under the weight of the rogue vanguard pouring into the obsidian chamber. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone, spilled blood, and burning pine torches that cast long, dancing shadows across the granite walls. Seraphina stood at the center of the chaos, her fingers wrapped tightly around the leather-bound hilt of her massive claymore. The blade rested against the stone floor, its polished steel reflecting the flickering firelight. Her dark leather armor was splattered with the ash of the fortress gates she had dismantled, her eyes blazing with an ancient, untamed fury. A few paces away, Orion stepped forward, his colossal frame cutting a terrifying silhouette against the crimson banners of the usurped throne. The heavy, silver-lined chains that had bound him in the deepest undercroft lay shattered at his feet, melted and torn apart by the sheer force of his awakening aura. His chest expanded, drawing in a deep, unimpeded breath of the cold air that now rushed through the broken high windows. The ice-blue light in his eyes flared to life, answering the primordial call of his queen's presence. The bond between them, forged in the frozen wilderness and sealed in blood, pulsed with an undeniable, suffocating gravity. Dorian took a panicked step backward, the golden hair that usually fell perfectly around his arrogant face now damp with sweat. His hand trembled violently against the pommel of his longsword, his knuckles turning white as he realized the layout of the fortress had completely changed. The hierarchy had flipped in a single heartbeat. The hunt was over, and the public claim had just begun. The rogue wolves Seraphina had commanded continued to flood the upper galleries, their cutlasses and axes catching the light, completely cutting off any avenue of escape for the traitorous war council. Seraphina did not look at Dorian. Her focus was entirely locked onto her husband, reading the subtle shifts in his posture with the precision of someone who had spent her entire life studying the living architecture of broken things. She felt the wrongness in him immediately, an intuitive awareness moving toward his hidden pain automatically. Orion held his left side with a carefulness that looked entirely casual to an untrained eye, but it was not. His heavy, dark coat covered whatever damage the torturers had inflicted beneath the fabric, but when he shifted his weight to face the remaining guards, the movement was abbreviated, tightly controlled. It was the calculated movement of a sovereign, measuring exactly what his body could afford to expend before collapsing. She did not comment on his weakness. He did not offer an explanation. They stood in the mutual, heavy silence of two survivors who had both spent lifetimes enduring isolation, understanding completely that silence was not inherently hostile, but rather a fortress of its own. Dorian tried to speak, his voice cracking against the tension in the room. "This is madness," he hissed, trying to rally the few loyalist guards who crouched behind the overturned oak tables. "She is a broken wolf, an outcast. You are backing a ghost." Serafina raised her claymore with a fluid, terrifying ease that defied her slight frame, the tip pointing directly at Dorian's throat. "Silence, traitor," she commanded, her voice dropping into that lethal, rhythmic cadence that vibrated through the sternum of every warrior present. "Your reign ended the moment I breached the outer wall." The broad-shouldered rogue commander who had led the breach stepped up to Serafina's flank, his axe resting on his shoulder. "The perimeter is secure, my Luna. The bastions are ours." Orion looked down at Serafina, his tight jaw relaxing only a fraction as he recognized the sheer competence of her command. He had watched her hands when he thought she wasn't looking during their brief encounters in the past, but she had always been looking. She had learned through 10 years of enforced invisibility within the pack to track the attention of others with peripheral precision. To feel a gaze the way a seasoned tracker feels a sudden change in air pressure. Orion's gaze had always returned to her with a weight that exceeded simple curiosity. It was a recognition held carefully in check, awaiting fire. Now, that fire was unleashed. Serafina stepped closer to him, her left hand coming off the hilt of her sword. She reached out, her palm hovering just inches from his wounded side. She had told the pack she had some basic training under Marin, the elite pack physician who had shielded her for years. But she had never spoken of the hidden, forbidden magic that slept beneath her skin. She kept it suppressed with the ease of long practice, but looking at Orion's strain, she allowed the faintest warmth to emanate from her skin, helping the hidden lacerations beneath his coat begin to close. Orion sat back against the arm of the stone throne, staying completely still throughout her touch, watching the middle distance with the non-expression of a man choosing very deliberately what to do with his face while enduring agonizing pain. As he shifted, the top 2 fastenings of his heavy collar came undone. There, at the base of his throat, where the collarbone met the chest, Serafina caught sight of a silver mark. It was fine-lined and ancient, the kind of mark that was not tattooed by human hands, but seemed to have grown from the bone itself, pressed into the flesh by something that preceded ink and needles. She caught only a fragment of it before his coat shifted back into place. But that fragment lodged in her mind with the insistence of a vision that demanded to be understood. She had seen that exact geometry before, not on a person, but etched in silver blue bark within the ancient trees of the sacred clearing 3 days north of the border. It was the cardinal signature, the punctuation that appeared at the 4 compass positions around the spiral ruins of the old world. It was foundational. It was a sovereign decree written in flesh. She lowered her hand, keeping her facial expression perfectly still. Orion was looking directly at her when she raised her eyes. He had felt her gaze linger on the mark. His cyan eyes were steady, watchful, and held a quality she could only describe as intensely careful. It was the carefulness of a wolf standing on thin winter ice, listening intently for the precise sound that would tell him how much weight it could bear before shattering. "Thank you," Orion said, his deep voice carrying a rough resonance that meant far more than simple gratitude for the physical mending. "It wasn't deep," Seraphina replied, her voice steady, though her mind was spinning. Her words meant something entirely different. "I saw the mark. I know what you are." He held her gaze for a single moment longer than was conversational, then looked toward the heavy iron grates of the dungeon entrance. Seraphina felt the weight of the secrets between them turning over in her mind. She tried to follow the thread from the ancient bark of those sacred trees to the base of his throat, trying to find what truly connected them. She had the answer. She understood even then that she possessed all the pieces of the puzzle, but some part of her was terrified to put them together. She knew that the moment she did, something would change that could never be unchanged. The comfortable ambiguity of her past identity as a simple healer would be obliterated, replaced by something much larger and more frightening than a rebellion in a dark fortress. Suddenly, a heavy, coordinated cadence of footsteps echoed from the western corridors. 12 warriors, clad in heavy winter tracking gear, emerged from the shadows of the secondary archway. They moved with the disciplined, synchronized formation of the elite border patrol, their weapons drawn. Seraphina was on her feet before conscious thought could complete itself, her claymore raised, turning instantly toward the threat. Orion was already standing beside her. He had moved from his resting position to an upright stance without a sound and without a hint of urgency. Rising with the unhurried precision of an apex predator, for whom threat assessment was so deeply habitual it no longer registered as a conscious response. He placed himself slightly forward and to her left, shielding her flank. She noticed this immediate tactical alignment. She noticed he did it without looking at her, without a word of discussion, as though the geometry of their mutual defense was simply obvious to his bloodline. She noticed, too, that the controlled stillness he had maintained during his imprisonment had hardened into something entirely different. It was a readiness so complete it had no visible tells, an invisible tension waiting to snap. The trackers stopped at the edge of the great hall's dais. The lead tracker, a broad-shouldered man with deep veteran scars along his jaw, swept the chamber with a professional assessment, cataloging the bodies and the rogue banners. His eyes moved past Seraphina without stopping, searching for the source of the dominant aura in the room. Then, his gaze locked onto Orion. What happened to the veteran's face was not something Seraphina had a simple word for. His expression cycled through several distinct emotions, too quickly to name individually. Profound recognition, total disbelief, immense relief, and a lingering shadow of absolute terror. It came to rest on a singular, crushing realization. It was the reckoning of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been violently restructured. The tracker dropped to his knees. Not slowly, not with the rehearsed grace of a court ceremony, but the way a massive stone building drops when its central pillars are blown away. He fell completely and at once, his right fist slamming hard against his armored chest in the ancient salute of absolute vassalage. Behind him, in a silent ripple that traveled down the line from front to back, the 11 other elite trackers performed the exact same gesture, their armor clinking against the granite floor. The vast hall went deathly quiet, save for the crackle of the dying torches. "My king," the lead tracker said. The words landed the way massive boulders land from a great height. They were not delivered loudly, but they carried an immense, definitive weight that rearranged everything they touched upon impact. Seraphina did not move. She did not breathe. She stood with her claymore still raised, feeling those 2 syllables move through her chest, ricocheting off the walls of her mind. "My king." She turned her head slowly toward the man standing slightly in front of her, the man who had survived the betrayal of his own war council, the man who had suffered in silence while Dorian attempted to claim his throne, the man who had quietly accepted her presence in the northern clearing weeks ago without demanding her submission. She looked at Orion, whose true name and title were now settling into her consciousness with the slow, cold clarity of a rising tide. He was not just a betrayed alpha. He was the sovereign. The lead tracker began to speak, his voice tight with urgency. "We were ambushed by Dorian's vanguard on the southern ridge, my king. False intelligence from the inner court. We believed you dead. The 7 territories and all 14 constituent pacts are currently in motion, believing the throne is vacant." Seraphina heard the words from a distance. The way one hears the rushing of water when the mind is occupied with a revelation too massive to leave unattended. The pieces were assembling themselves without her permission. The specific, silver-poisoned wounds Orion carried, the remote location where he had been cornered, the careful absence of any identifying marks on his armor when he was captured. He had known what she was from the moment she breached the dungeons. He had known, and he had said nothing while she led her rogue forces to his rescue. She lowered her claymore, setting the tip against the stone floor with a care that was entirely at odds with the storm raging inside her chest. Orion turned to her, his voice very quiet, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered army. "Seraphina." She looked at him, her amber eyes locking on to his cyan gaze. His jaw was tight with the specific tension of a man who had been preparing for an impossible conversation and had found, now that the moment had arrived, that all his preparation was entirely insufficient. "I was going to tell you the full truth once the fortress was secure," he said, his voice dropping low so only she could hear. A sharp, breathless sound came out of Seraphina. It was not a laugh, though it carried the brief exhale and the opening of the mouth associated with one. It carried absolutely none of laughter's warmth. It was broken, small, and entirely involuntary. It was the sound of something snapping cleanly under a psychological pressure that had been building for far longer than this single night. She turned away from him, walking toward the high-arched windows that looked out over the darkened forest. Orion did not call after her. Nor did he attempt to follow. He knew better than to crowd a hunting wolf when she was processing a trap. She walked until the immediate crowd of trackers and rogues was fully behind her. Standing in the cold draft of the broken stone casing, pressing the heel of her hand hard against her sternum as she breathed. Slowly, deliberately, it was the way one breathes when the alternative is a total collapse that cannot be afforded in front of witnesses, even when those witnesses are loyal soldiers. "My king," she whispered to herself. The hidden mark on her own wrist began to pulse, radiating a patient, directional warmth. She pressed her wrist flat against the cold granite of the fortress pillar, feeling the solid, unyielding reality of the stone against her skin. She thought with a clarity that felt almost like a dangerous calm. How many more things are there in this Vunkwok that I do not know? The stones offered no answer. They never did. They merely waited, the way the world always waited for her to finish falling apart so she could stand up and keep moving. She breathed in the scent of winter. She breathed out the remnants of her shock. Orion approached her 20 minutes later, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried. He was not tracking her through the shadows so much as simply walking in her direction, as though the emotional distance between them were a tactical problem with an obvious solution that merely required patience. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, standing with his large hands completely visible and away from his weapons. It was the exact same posture he had used when he first approached her camp in the neutral woods. She had thought then that it was merely the polite etiquette of a traveling stranger avoiding a defensive reaction. She understood now it was something entirely different. He was deliberately making himself unthreatening to her, choosing it over and over in ways she was only now cataloging and understanding the full weight of. "You have 2 minutes," Seraphina said without turning around, her voice cutting through the cold air. "Before I decide, I would rather clear this hall alone." A brief pause followed, filled only by the distant crackle of the great hall's hearth. Then came the sound of Orion settling his massive weight against the adjacent granite pillar, bringing himself down to a less imposing height. It was another deliberate choice to level the playing field between them. She noted it silently and waited. The ambush by the War Council wasn't an opportunistic coup, Orion began, speaking without any theatrical performance. There was no careful architecture of persuasion in his tone, no soft, manipulative approach through easier truths toward harder ones. He delivered the information plainly, as though he had decided that anything less than absolute directness would be its own kind of insult to her intelligence. There was a bloodline, he told her, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line below the fortress. An ancient line, much older than the current pack hierarchy that Dorian tried to steal. It is older than the 7 territories as a political structure, older than most of the history that the scholars wrote down and passed forward. The Lunara. Seraphina's hand tightened against the stone pillar. They were healers, Orion continued, but the word itself doesn't fully capture what they were. They were not simply people who could mend flesh and stitch leather through wounds. They were individuals through whom the primal life force of the world moved like an electric current through a perfect conductor. They could feel the living architecture of any creature, could see the invisible threads of sickness and strength, and could speak to the flesh in its own ancient language. They were exceedingly rare always, and their rarity made them precious to the realm. Eventually, that preciousness made them dangerous to those who craved simple, brutal control. He shifted slightly, his cyan eyes reflecting the distant stars. Because the Lunara possessed one other specific property that distinguished them from any other healer lineage in existence. They were the only wolves who could fully bond with the waking sovereign. It was not a standard mating bond, Serafina. It was something far older, more fundamental, a perfect resonance between two complementary forces that, when completed, amplified both beyond measure. The king's primal power deepened. The Lunara's healing gift expanded into something godlike. Together, they became what the history scrolls described as the completion of the bloodline's true purpose. He paused, letting the weight of the lore settle into the cold air. Those who had built their personal power in the corrupt spaces between kings, those who formed the war council and the high courts, found this natural arrangement incredibly inconvenient. A generation ago, they decided to do something about it. The Lunara houses were dismantled. They were not scattered, they were systematically erased. Every house, every lineage, every child old enough to manifest the golden green light was taken. It was done with the absolute thoroughness of people who wanted to ensure there was no coming back from the slaughter. The very few who escaped were hunted ruthlessly in the years that followed, until the hunters were entirely satisfied there was nothing left to find. He looked at her profile, his voice dropping an octave. They did not find your parents in time, Serafina. She turned around slowly, her back pressing against the cold, pine-paneled wall of the window recess. She was facing him fully now, her amber eyes wide, reflecting the ambient glow of her own rising emotion. Orion sat in the snow that had drifted through the broken casing, his forearms resting on his knees, his cyan eyes locked onto her face. "My parents," she whispered, the words heavy in her throat. "They were Lunara, both," Orion confirmed. "Your father carried the raw healing gift, the light that can rebuild shattered bone. Your mother carried the bond sense, the instinctual ability to feel the sovereign's mark across vast distances and move toward it. You do not just inherit their legacies, Serafina. You possess both gifts simultaneously. You have more than both." Serafina looked down, her mind suddenly racing back to a fractured memory from her earliest childhood. She had almost no memories of her father before he vanished, but she had one distinct image. His large, warm hands wrapped completely around her small ones in the pitch black of a hidden cellar. She remembered the sensation of a strange, rhythmic warmth moving between their palms, and his deep voice saying a word she had never been able to fully retrieve from the shadows of her mind, a word that felt like a secret name, that she had carried that isolated memory for 17 years without knowing what to do with it, treating it like a useless relic. Now she pressed it flat inside her chest, realizing its true, devastating shape. "The gift isn't a curse," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was not a question. She was repeating the phrase to see how it felt in her own mouth, trying to rewrite a decade of public humiliation and psychological torment. "They always told me it was a deformity, a dangerous sickness that needed to be purged." "They told you what frightened them," Orion said simply, his tone carrying a hard, protective edge. "Small people always do that, Serafina. They dress their own terrifying cowardice as your personal flaw, and then they hand it to you to carry so they don't have to look at their own weakness. The silence that followed their words was thick, possessed of a physical texture that seemed to press against the granite walls. Serafina stood within it and felt her hands beginning to warm at her sides. She had not asked the magic to rise. She had not triggered it through a conscious act of will, but the golden green light was rising within her palms regardless, carrying the unhurried certainty of a power that had simply decided it was entirely done being suppressed by fear. The light was steady, brilliant, far brighter than any glow she had ever produced without making direct physical contact with an open wound. It illuminated the dark leather of her armor and cast a vibrant radiance across the stone floor. She looked down at her own glowing palms, her breath catching. "I can't make it stop," she said, her voice coming out much quieter than she had intended, sounding almost like a plea for stability. "I know," Orion replied, his voice incredibly gentle, devoid of the harsh authority he used with his soldiers. "It hasn't been able to stop since we met in the northern clearing. The moment you used your power to keep me alive, you completed the first stage of the Sovereign Seal." Serafina raised her eyes from her hands to his exposed collarbone. The silver mark was fully visible now, his heavy coat thrown open at the throat against the cold draft. The silver lines seemed to shimmer in response to her proximity. She looked at the fragment she had memorized in secret, then looked at the faint patterns pulsing along her own wrists. Putting the geometric shapes together properly for the first time in her life. It was the way one finally sees an intricate image hidden within a complex weaver's pattern after staring at it for too long. They were two halves of the exact same ancient crest. "You felt it," she stated, her realization hardening into a certainty. "Before I ever found you dying in that snowbank, you felt me moving through the forest." Something swift and unreadable moved across Orion's face, an expression too brief and too internal to fully surface before it was gone. "I felt an ancient force moving through the wilderness toward my position," he admitted. "I was bleeding out, surrounded by the War Council's hounds. I honestly thought it was the end of my line. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of this." She looked at her glowing hands for a long, agonizing moment. She had been handed so many false identities over the course of her miserable life within the Ashvale Pack, and absolutely none of them had ever fit. Servant, outcast, burden, nothing. Cursed Omega. She had worn each of those labels with the dull, numb compliance of someone who had been told often enough that other people's definitions were far more reliable than her own internal compass. She had never thrown any of them off because she had been terrified of what she would find hidden underneath the armor of her compliance. This was what was underneath. A sovereign's anchor. A warrior queen of a forgotten line. "I need time," she said, her voice regaining its steady, lethal edge. "You have all the time you need," Orion said, rising from his position against the pillar, without placing any pressure on her, without pushing for a commitment she wasn't ready to give. "I am not going anywhere, my Luna." She almost said something in response to the title, but chose to hold her peace. She held the vibrant warmth in her palms and looked out through the high stone archway at the white. snow-covered distance of the kingdom she had just disrupted, trying to find the true boundaries of what she was rapidly becoming. Meanwhile, behind the massive granite walls of the High Court, located 2 weeks of hard riding to the south, a drastically different conversation was taking place within a candlelit study. The visitor had arrived at the southern fortress long after dark, a timing that was either a tactical coincidence or a calculated preference. The host suspected preference because the elegant, lean aristocrat who had just entered had always favored darkness as a personal aesthetic and political choice. He was a composed, dangerous man who spoke with the distinct, archaic accent of the old northern court, possessing the deep, resonant voice of someone who had spent decades being the most lethal presence in any room and had grown quietly bored of the reality. The aristocrat sat across the private oak table from the High Lord of the Southern Territory, his fine leather gloves still on, a silver cup of spiced wine sitting between them, entirely untouched. He spoke with the unhurried calm of an executioner, delivering news he considered himself remarkably generous for sharing. "The true king has been located," the aristocrat stated, his voice flat. "Not by our scouts, and not by the War Council's border patrol. By someone else. Or perhaps something else." The Lord's hand rested flat on the polished wood of the table, his rings catching the candlelight. "My sources in the neutral territories are remarkably inconsistent on the specific details, but they are entirely consistent on the core fact. Orion is alive. He is recovering somewhere within the perimeter of the old forest, and he is absolutely not alone." The Lord's jaw tightened. "The girl. The exile we cast out." The aristocrat nodded slowly, his tone carrying her name without any emotional inflection. "We vastly underestimated what that Omega assistant was. That was a catastrophic error in our political calculations. It will not be repeated." The fire in the hearth between them popped loudly, a spark flying against the iron screen before settling into gray ash. "The bond," the Lord said carefully, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Has it been sealed?" "It has begun," the aristocrat replied, finally picking up the silver cup and turning it once between his gloved fingers without drinking from it. "But it is not yet completed. There is still a narrow window of time. If Orion does not survive to complete the final stage of the Sovereign Seal, the bond naturally dissolves. A king is severely weakened without his Lunara anchor. He becomes manageable." He set the cup down with a soft, definitive click against the wood. "With her, he becomes entirely unmanageable." The Lord thought back to the small, quiet girl who had moved through his great hall for 9 years with her simple wooden tray of herbal medicines. The girl he had watched with the predatory attention of a man who knows exactly what kind of prize he is keeping in a cage he built specifically to fit her. He realized now, with a sickening jolt of adrenaline, that he had not built that cage nearly well enough. "How many men do you require to eliminate the threat?" the Lord asked, his hand drifting toward his signet ring. The aristocrat smiled, a cold, mechanical movement of the lips that failed to reach his dead eyes. "Not many," he murmured, his voice smooth as silk. "Just very fast ones." Back in the great hall of the captured fortress, 3 nights after the revelation of the sovereign mark, a sudden shift occurred in the surrounding atmosphere. Seraphina felt them before she heard them. It was a violent, unnatural wrongness in the forest's breathing outside the broken walls. The complex web of life force that she could now read as clearly as an experienced captain reads the approaching weather went suddenly. The uniformly silent. The birds in the high rafters stopped their preening. The small mammals in the undergrowth vanished. The constant low hum of living things moving through the stone foundations ceased all at once. It was as though an invisible, giant hand had been clamped tightly over the mouth of the wilderness. She was on her feet, her hand gripping the hilt of her claymore before her eyes were even fully open. Orion was already standing at the edge of the dais, facing the northern battlements, completely still. It was no longer the cautious stillness of a hiding tracker. It was something ancient, elemental. The absolute stillness of a creature at the apex of the food chain, deciding with great deliberation whether the exact moment for slaughter had arrived. "How many?" Seraphina asked, her voice steady as she stepped up to his flank. It was not a question born of fear, but a request for a target count. "Enough to make it interesting," Orion replied, his muscles bunching beneath his dark armor. "Stay behind me, Seraphina." The old Seraphina, the broken healer, who had spent a decade being told exactly where to stand, what to think, and what to be, might have simply complied with the command. But the warrior queen who had broken the gates of Ashvale merely shifted her stance. Spreading her feet wide on the granite floor and raising her hands high, she let the golden-green light rise completely unchecked in her palms for the first time, refusing to flinch from the blinding brightness of her own awakening majesty. Orion glanced back at her just once. Something profound and fiercely proud moving through his expression that she didn't have time to fully read before the attack commenced. Then they came through the shattered windows and the broken reinforced doors. 14 assassins breached the perimeter simultaneously. They were the fast ones promised by the High Lords, dressed not in the recognizable gray of Ashvale, but in unmarked, pitch-black traveling clothes that offered no allegiance. They moved with the terrifying, coordinated efficiency of specialized executioners who had been given a single, absolute task and had performed it successfully 100 times before. They attacked from 3 separate tactical directions simultaneously, which was a flawless martial maneuver. They carried curved short swords and long daggers treated with a substance that smelled entirely wrong to Seraphina's heightened senses, and acrid. The chemical sharpness beneath the cold steel that caused the sovereign mark on her wrist to contract like skin touching raw fire. She had no time to analyze the nature of the poison. Orion shifted his weight. Seraphina had braced herself intellectually for the sight of his transformation. She had seen it once before in the dark of the northern clearing, while half delirious from the winter cold. But she was upright this time, fully conscious, her senses amplified by the resonance of their bond. She watched the transformation happen a mere 10 feet in front of her, and she felt the air in the great hall change, the exact way it changes split seconds before lightning strikes an iron rod. The room became pressurized, heavy, electric, every single hair on her body rising in response to the primal power. The colossal black wolf filled the space where the sovereign man had been, his fur as dark as a starless winter sky, his ice-blue eyes flashing with the fury of a trapped god. The forest outside seemed to howl in sympathy, and the architecture of the great hall rearranged itself around his massive presence as he lunged forward to tear the traitors apart. The thunderous roar of blue lightning accompanied the full restoration of the Alpha King. No longer the weak, flickering sparks Seraphina had desperately pressed her hands against in the damp subterranean dark. This was the terrifying reality of Orion's true power. Electric arcs crackled violently across his massive shoulders and flanks in branching, continuous lines. His primal eyes blazed a lethal cyan in the gloom of the storming fortress, and the ancient sovereign markings along his pitch-black pelt burned a silver-white brilliance, fully realized. He was no longer the broken, chained wolf awaiting execution by the treacherous war council. He was exactly what the supreme ruler had been before the ambush: complete, terrible, and magnificent in the way things are when they refuse to compromise their own nature. When the first wave of traitorous guards threw themselves at him, the sound of the collision was deafening. Seraphina fought aggressively at the flank of the chaos. She had never claimed to be an ordinary, submissive Luna, and she harbored no illusions about the sheer brutality of this civil war. But she had her heavy claymore, her unbound rogue pack, and the electric fury of their rediscovered mate bond. These elements were no longer separate forces, they were a singular weapon. When two elite assassins broke away from the main melee and charged directly toward her, peeling away with the calculated purpose of soldiers who had been told exactly which target needed to be eliminated to break the king's spirit. She did not flinch. She met them with her massive blade swinging in a vicious arc, the sheer momentum throwing them off balance, while her strategic commands rallied the rogues to overwhelm their senses. One went down with a severed throat, while the other staggered back into the shadows. Through the vibration of the stone floor, she could track every movement of the war behind her. The weight of the conflict pressed against her boots. She could feel Orion's life force in the way one feels a raging fire, enormous, blazing, and kinetically shifting through the traitors like a devastating river carving through a fragile landscape, reshaping everything it touched. The usurpers' forces were losing ground, but there were still too many of them. They had fortified this fortress for a prolonged siege, and attrition was its own kind of victory for the defense. As Seraphina turned to press deeper into the inner sanctum, a third assassin lunged at her from her blind spot on the left. She had not anticipated the strike. The traitor had remained entirely still, dead enough inside his own heart that her heightened wolf senses found nothing to read until it was too late. The cold steel of a dagger entered her side below the ribs, but the true agony came immediately after the blade penetrated her flesh. A sickening wrongness rode the metal into her body like a secondary, deeper wound. A specialized freezing paralysis began spreading through her veins. The deep, resonant voice of an American woman recounted the story of Alpha King, a romantic war. Her knees slammed against the stone floor. The strength in her arms faltered, her grip loosening on the hilt of her claymore. Between one heartbeat and the next, her fierce momentum vanished into nothingness. Pressing her palm against the bleeding gash, she felt her own inner wolf desperately fighting to heal the tissue. only to be suppressed and smothered beneath the rapidly advancing poison. The sudden absence of her supernatural stamina was more terrifying than the physical puncture itself. She did not see the shift in the battle. She heard it. The entire frequency of the violence altered in an instant, a lethal pitch entering the air that had not been there a second prior. Lifting her bloodied chin, she saw Orion across the hall, mid-strike, already twisting his massive form toward her. The soldier he had been eviscerating was discarded on the stones. Though still locked in his colossal black wolf form, the Alpha King stood completely motionless, his cyan eyes locked onto her bleeding figure. The expression within those burning eyes was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated fury and terror, a protective rage that no ordinary beast could contain. In 3 massive, ground-shaking strides, he crossed the chamber, shifting back into his towering human form mid-motion. He dropped to his knees before her, catching her shoulders before she collapsed sideways onto the cold granite. His rough hands cupped her face before dropping to examine the wound. He assessed the damage with the rapid precision of a warlord who had survived 100 battlefields, his jaw setting with a dangerous tightness. He had done the calculation, and the result was entirely unacceptable to him. Around them, the remaining conspirators pulled back temporarily, regrouping at the edges of the throne room, waiting with the patient malice of scavengers who believed time and the poison were on their side. "My Alpha." Seraphina's voice emerged much smaller than she intended, the venom creeping up her ribcage toward her heart. "I can feel the silver." "I know." Orion was already moving, his powerful arms repositioning her, pulling her upright against his broad chest, while his other hand pressed flat over hers, covering the wound to stanch the flow of blood. "Stop resisting the toxin. Stop forcing your wolf to heal it. The silver is feeding on your energy." "Be entirely still, Seraphina. I do not know how to yield when you are in chains," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his leather jerkin. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was not loud, yet it cut through the din of clashing steel outside the chamber doors. She focused on him. His face was mere inches from hers. And whatever carefully constructed facade of royal restraint he usually maintained had shattered completely. There was no shield between her soul and the raw emotion in his eyes. It was ancient, vast, and carried the terrifying weight of a power that had been suppressed for too long and had simply chosen, in this ruined hall, with his mate bleeding and traitors circling, to stop accepting containment. "There is an ancient right," Orion murmured, his voice laced with absolute gravity. "The Lycan King's sovereign claim. It has only been invoked twice in the written histories of the 7 territories, both times by absolute consensus. And it is a blood bond that can never be undone. I need you to understand the permanence of it before I initiate the bond." "What does it demand of you?" she asked, gasping against the burning chill in her chest. A heavy pause followed, the deliberate silence of a monarch choosing his words with the precision one applies to things that dictate life and death. "It unifies our life forces entirely," he explained. "It grants you everything that defines my sovereignty. My power, my ancestral bloodline, my physical resilience. It becomes a shared reservoir between us. The poison will have no single entity to destroy, for we will become one." Serafina understood immediately what he was leaving unsaid. She knew what this cost a ruler. She knew the immense vulnerability a king accepted by splitting his ancestral might, exposing himself entirely to a mate in a world where he had just been hunted, ambushed, and overthrown by his closest advisors. "You do not owe me your crown to save my life," she whispered. "I know," Orion replied, his gaze boring into hers with fierce devotion. "I know I do not have to." He pressed his forehead firmly against hers, and the chaotic boundaries of the burning fortress seemed to dissolve. She felt the transformation begin at the marking on her wrist, a sudden, explosive heat that bore no resemblance to mere warmth. It was a scorching, absolute fire, foundational and pure, spreading up her forearm, crossing her chest, and driving downward into the frozen cavity where the poison had been taking root. Her own internal mark flared in violent response from her collarbone, the two halves of their shattered bond reaching out to lock together across the small space between their chests, like iron clasps snapping shut. The moment the connection solidified, the sound that reverberated through the stone fortress was not a physical noise, it was a psychic shockwave. Their alpha markings blazed a brilliant silver gold, brighter than either aura had ever been in isolation. Light erupted from their bodies simultaneously, fusing in the space between them into a radiant barrier that neither could have manifested alone. She felt Orion's ancestral power flood her veins like a shattering dawn, not as a foreign addition, but as a total awakening. As if a long-locked vault within her blood had been violently broken open. It was vast, primal, and entirely without limit. The wolfsbane and silver burned away instantly. She felt the toxin retract, dissolving under the pressure of an ancient royal lineage it had never been designed to encounter. Serafina gasped, her lungs expanding fully as she opened her eyes to a fundamentally altered reality. The throne room was still a ruined, blood-spattered chamber of granite and smoke, but her vision had transformed. She could see the ambient energy of the fortress itself, the pulsing silver threads of magic embedded in the ancient foundation stones. She could see the surviving traders at the edge of the hall as thermal signatures, those still standing, and those who would never rise from the floor again. She looked at Orion, his forehead still resting against hers, his eyes closed in deep concentration. His expression was that of a man who had surrendered half of his soul and discovered, against all laws of nature, that he was infinitely stronger for it. Lifting her hand between them, she observed her fingers. Her skin no longer bore the pale look of a frail woman. Her hands glowed with a fierce, golden-green warrior's light. But running directly beneath the surface were veins of brilliant cyan, his lightning. Her resilience and his destructive power had wound together into a single, devastating force. When Orion finally opened his eyes, his pupils were a matching, luminous cyan. She could feel the mutation within herself, the pale, radiant aura of her true lineage fully realized, reflecting back the eyes of her equal. At the far side of the chamber, the remaining members of the treacherous war council fled into the dark corridors. And neither of them bothered to watch them run. The fortress seemed to exhale, the smoke clearing slowly as the fires in the hearths stabilized. Orion's arms wrapped around her completely, pulling her into a fierce embrace, and she let herself lean into him, pressing her face against his neck. They were no longer a deposed king and an outcast wife. They were two sovereigns who had endured betrayal, execution orders, and a bloody siege to meet at the exact same pinnacle of power. "You are burning hot," she whispered, her voice rough from the smoke and the strain. He exhaled deeply against her hair. "You are alive." "It is the exact same thing now," she replied. The reckoning at the High Court. Serafina had never marched toward a destination with such absolute authority before. Her entire existence within the Ashvale Pack had been a sequence of forced retreats, away from the council chambers, away from the aristocratic gatherings, away from the sacred stone circle on the night she was meant to be honored, and away from the Great Hall, where she had been forced to act as a silent assistant to healer Marin. She had spent years moving away from contempt, away from public humiliation, and away from the political machinations that sought to crush her spirit. Now she rode toward the High Court of the Seven Territories, with her spine perfectly rigid, her chin held high, and the sovereign claim bond glowing a vibrant silver gold upon her wrist. She did not cast a single glance behind her. The Grand Court of the High King was nothing like the provincial halls of Ashvale. While Ashvale had been engineered to intimidate, to remind every member of their rigid place within the hierarchy, the grand fortress of the sovereign realm had been constructed to reflect something far greater than individual ambition. It was a monument of ancient weathered stone and open sky. Its massive corridors led outward toward the horizons, rather than twisting inward into dark secrecy. The central throne room possessed no stone ceiling. Instead, a massive glass vault stood open to the heavens, allowing the light of the full moon to pour down in a magnificent silver column. 14 distinct packs were represented within the chamber. 40 high-ranking nobles and 3 centuries of accumulated military power stood in silent, rigid rows as Serafina and Orion walked side by side down the center aisle. She felt the weight of their staring eyes. She welcomed it. Her own gaze was a luminous, pale cyan now, a physical manifestation of the bond she had grown entirely accustomed to during the 10 days of hard travel across the territories. Her hands pulsed with a faint, dangerous light under the torch glare, offering neither hiding nor apology. She was done apologizing for the power she wielded. Orion walked directly beside her, not a single step ahead, not a single step behind. He was establishing an undeniable truth to the court, and she acknowledged the deliberate nature of his stance. The Lycan Grand Council convened as the first light of dawn pierced the glass ceiling. It was not a conventional trial. A trial implies an uncertain verdict, but by the time the High Alphas took their seats in the Chamber of Judgment, the conclusion had the absolute weight of an inevitability. The traitorous Beta Dorian stood at the center of the chamber under heavy guard. The golden-haired usurper who had led the War Council's coup looked remarkably diminished. He was still broad-shouldered and possessed the handsome features built for pack admiration, but his bearing had turned brittle, as though the very ground he stood upon had developed a tremor he could neither locate nor control. His eyes darted to Serafina's face, instantly flinching away from the lethal cyan of her gaze, before catching on the silver-gold sovereign mark on her wrist and dropping entirely to the stone floor. The documentation was undeniable. Dorian had negotiated with rogue factions and corrupt council members, trading the security of the realm's borders for political leverage and the guaranteed overthrow of the king. He had viewed Seraphina as a minor inconvenience, an asset to be discarded or used as a pawn in his ascent. He had fundamentally misunderstood what she was. That detail was officially entered into the records, though it absolved him of nothing. The Grand Council stripped him of his rank and titles within 3 concise sentences. 4 distinct execution marks were carved into the formal record, one for each territory his treason had endangered. Seraphina watched the eradication of his status with a profound, quiet stillness. She felt no petty satisfaction, only the cold reality of a massive debt finally being correctly assigned to the man who had incurred it. The Elder Alpha of the Ashvale Pack was brought forward next. He required no guards, having surrendered the moment Orion's loyalist forces breached the Outer Valley. He stood before the tribunal with his silver-streaked hair and cold gray eyes, but for the first time in memory, those eyes were devoid of calculation. They were simply exhausted. He bowed his head deeply before the new authority. "I recognized the depth of her lineage," the Elder Alpha confessed to the council, his voice directed toward the floor. "I intentionally withheld the archives of the Lunara Pack to keep her lineage suppressed and controllable. I convinced myself it was for the stability of the territory. It was cowardice." The ensuing silence in the chamber was heavy. Seraphina looked down at the ruler who had demanded her submission while sealing away her ancestral history. She took a slow, measured breath, finding that her old anger had burned itself out in the crucible of the fortress siege, leaving behind something far purer, absolute clarity. "I have no interest in your local titles," Seraphina declared, her voice echoing flawlessly through the vaulted chamber. "I do not want the lordship of Ashvale, nor do I require your public degradation. I demand the immediate release of the Lunara archives, the historical texts, the ancestral bloodline records, and the names of every family your council silenced after the Great Purge." Her hands glowed brightly at her sides, steady and unyielding. "I want my people's history returned to them in full." The Elder Alpha looked up at her for a long, silent moment, recognizing the futility of resistance. He nodded once, a small, definitive movement of a man finally laying down a burden he had carried for far too long. "It is granted," he whispered. The coronation ceremony that followed was devoid of unnecessary, hollow pageantry. She had been offered the traditional 3-day procession, the elaborate court rituals designed to display wealth to the 14 visiting packs. She had listened to the details with polite detachment before declining, requesting instead the only version that held absolute meaning. The official recording of the bloodline, the validation of the sovereign claim, and the public recognition of her independence. She stood beneath the open glass vault of the high hall, the midday sun shining directly upon her armor. Orion stood firmly to her left as the Grand Council's heavy seal was pressed into the parchment of the realm. For the first time in the history of the territories, her name was read aloud in an official capacity. Seraphina of the Lunara, Queen Regnant, sovereign in her own right. Not a consort, not a companion to the throne, a ruler by her own authority. The specific phrasing had been insisted upon by Orion with a quiet, a dangerous firmness that permitted zero negotiation from the conservative elements of the council. When she turned to look at him upon hearing the words, she found him watching her with an expression she could now read perfectly, the look of a warrior who was not granting a gift, but returning stolen property, fully understanding the profound difference between the two. She accepted the crown with her hands openly glowing, making no effort to dim the golden-green light laced with cyan lightning. The return of spring. They returned to the ancient clearing in the Wildlands during the first true week of spring. The forest had only begun to shift, the season existing more as an intention than a physical reality. Patches of old winter snow still lingered in the deep shadows beneath the roots of the ancient pines. But the earth had softened, turning rich and dark. The first green shoots were pressing tentatively upward through the fallen needles, testing whether the lethal frost had truly relented. The air possessed the sharp, clean crispness of a wilderness that had survived a brutal winter and recognized its own endurance. Without the heavy blankets of snow, the clearing appeared different, smaller perhaps, in the way all battlefields seem smaller once the immediate violence has departed. It was simply a circle of ancient trees standing witness in the quiet forest, their trunks marked with the faint contours of old runes that pulsed gently within the bark. They were glowing a distinct gold now, Serafina observed. The cold, silver-blue light she had witnessed during her exile had transformed into a deep, constant gold, the exact hue of her own power. It was as if the ancient grove itself had absorbed the essence of the magic invoked on that freezing winter night, carrying the warmth forward into the new season. Orion stood at the perimeter of the trees, his dark cloak catching the wind, as he watched her walk the exact circumference of the clearing. She paused at each ancient pine, pressing her palm against the bark, feeling the sap and the life moving steadily beneath the surface. The language of the forest was entirely fluent to her now, a dialect she felt she had been born knowing, but had only recently been permitted to speak. She came to a stop beside him, her gaze fixing on the center of the grove, where she had once knelt over his dying, a massive wolf form with nothing but her bare hands and sheer defiance. "Do you harbor any regrets?" Orion asked softly, his eyes scanning her face. "Regarding any portion of the path that brought you here?" Serafina looked down at her hands. They were glowing with a low, perpetual warmth that she no longer sought to suppress or disguise. Gold-green light permanently intertwined with his brilliant cyan lightning. The two forces so thoroughly fused that it was impossible to discern where her resilience ended and his destruction began. She thought of the cold stone circle in Ashvale. She thought of the 37 steps of forced dignity she had taken into the dark after Dorian's public rejection. She remembered the long, freezing days alone in the wilderness, the small fires she had coaxed to life, the injured forest creatures she had quietly healed, and the exact second she had knelt in the freezing drifts beside a fallen king. Realizing her power was a profound purpose rather than a pack curse. "They branded me an outcast," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet trees. "It turns out I was simply designed for a destiny their structure could not possibly survive." Orion turned his gaze toward her, his expression filled with a quiet, absolute reverence. Around them, the ancient pines glowed a soft, enduring gold, and the first birds of the new season moved through the canopy above. The forest breathed in the slow, ancient rhythm of a living entity that had remained patient through the longest winter and had finally, in its own correct season, been proven entirely right. Serafina turned her face up toward the sunlight, filtering through the new green branches, letting the warmth find her skin. She had never been truly broken. She had simply been held in the wrong hands.